Hello, this is Mark from Spanish Property Insight. Today I'm going to look at the war in Ukraine and its impact on Spain because this government has used the war and its fallout to justify intervening in the Spanish housing market with measures that are not trivial. So I thought I would look at what impact, if any, the war in faraway Ukraine has had on Spain, which is a question I haven't seen discussed much to date, and explain what the government has done in response as far as the housing market goes. Spoiler alert, landlords are the big losers. So how am I going to tackle this topic? First, I'll look at the war's impact on Spain using a number of measures like GDP and unemployment to gauge what price Spain is paying from the fallout of Putin's invasion of Ukraine. Then I'll explain the housing market interventions that the government has introduced, who benefits and who loses out, and how the government is using the war in Ukraine to justify them. Finally, and to spice up the presentation a bit, I'll float the idea that the government might have other reasons for intervening in the housing market unrelated to the war, a hidden agenda perhaps. Before turning to Spain, I'll just point out that Ukraine is 4,000 kilometers away, so Spain is nowhere near the conflict, unlike countries like Poland that has had to shelter 8.5 million refugees, along with other countries bordering the conflict that have been flooded with refugees. But countries far from the conflict have also suffered greatly. The UN estimates that the war has driven 95 million people around the world into extreme poverty. And higher food and energy prices as a consequence of the war have reduced real household budgets by almost 8% in Armenia, 5.5% in Georgia, and more than 3% in African countries like Egypt, South Africa, and Zambia, with a world average of 1.57%. The point being that the fallout from the war is deadly serious in many countries, both near and far from Ukraine, which is, of course, the country suffering the most. So, what about Spain? Back in the summer of last year, a report by the OECD found that, quote, Spanish families are the least affected by the rise in prices in terms of their incomes, whilst the Spanish finance minister Nadia Calviño, speaking around the same time, also said that Spain was one of the OECD countries least affected by the war. Of course, everyone in Spain feels the impact of inflation on their pockets, and the least well off feel it the most. But overall, what has been the impact on Spain and the economy? To get a better idea, I'll look at what has happened since the war started to Spanish GDP, unemployment, inflation, energy prices, tourism, and the housing market. Starting with GDP, how much of a hit has the Spanish economy taken from the war in Ukraine? Not much, judging by figures from the World Bank, which I found at Trading Economics. The World Bank estimates that the Spanish economy was bigger in 2022 than 2021 before the war, and bigger than the years before COVID. The Spanish economy might have grown more without the war, but it didn't do too badly anyway. Now let's look at unemployment, which was down 9% in December compared to a year before. And of course, that was a couple of months before the war started. La Moncloa, the office of the Spanish president, boasts that unemployment is lower now than at any time since 2007. So the war in Ukraine has not thrown lots of workers in Spain out of their jobs. Turning to inflation, headline inflation was 5.8% in December, according to the National Institute of Statistics, which is lower than it was in December 2021 before the war, when it was at 6.5%. It's true that inflation was high for most of last year, and no doubt the war was part of the reason. But by December, it was difficult to argue that the war was causing high inflation when inflation was in fact lower than it was before the war. Related to inflation are energy prices, and here I'm going to look specifically at electricity prices. As you can see from this chart, electricity prices are significantly lower than they were a year ago, more than 50% lower, in fact, according to data I got from Trading Economics. What about tourism, which plays a big role in the Spanish economy? Has tourism taken a hit from the war? It doesn't look like it, and nothing compared to the impact of COVID, as you can see from this chart. Tourists in the first 11 months of 2022 came in much higher numbers than 2021 before the war, though not as high as the years before the pandemic. And finally, what about the Spanish housing market? As you can see from this chart showing home sales in the third quarter every year going back to 2007, sales boomed whilst the war raged in Ukraine, with the highest sales in Q3 since 2007. The rental market in big cities was also hot as demand exceeded supply. There is no evidence that the Spanish housing market has suffered from the war in Ukraine. So Spain has been relatively unscathed by the war in Ukraine. Nevertheless, the government has used it to justify intervening on a number of fronts, including the housing market. In the final cabinet meeting of last year, on the 27th of December, the government passed a royal decree of medidas de respuesta a las consecuencias económicas y sociales de la guerra de Ucrania, which means measures to deal with the economic and social consequences of the war in Ukraine. As far as the housing market goes, the government introduced one new measure and extended two others on the grounds of increasing the protection of vulnerable groups. The new measure was a 6-month rental contract extension for sitting tenants with a deadline of June the 30th. This allows tenants to unilaterally extend rental contracts expiring before the 30th of June by 6 months with the same conditions, and it ties the landlord's hands for 6 months longer than expected. Secondly, the government extended a 2% cap on annual rental price revisions to the end of 2023. This cap was first introduced as a temporary measure in March 22 to protect tenants from surging inflation, in part triggered by the war in Ukraine, but also triggered by other things like government policy on the green transition and the COVID response. Under normal circumstances, landlords are allowed to increase the rent once a year in line with inflation, but now they can only increase it by 2%, though landlords who own 10 properties or less are still free to negotiate this with their tenants, but they cannot impose more than 2%. Whilst inflation is much higher than 2% as it is today, this means that the landlord gets a lower real income whilst tenants benefit from lower rental costs. Lower real rental costs, I should say. The government has given tenants an inflation windfall paid for by landlords. The French government has introduced a similar measure but set the cap at 3.5%, which is fairer to both sides. And finally, a ban on the eviction of vulnerable tenants with no other housing options has been extended to the 30th of June. This ban was introduced during the pandemic as a temporary measure, but keeps getting extended, so it now looks pretty permanent, with its continued existence now being justified by the war in Ukraine. It makes it difficult for landlords to evict tenants who stop paying the rent, and also makes it difficult to evict squatters. This measure gives tenants more power over landlords because both sides know that if the tenant decides not to pay the rent, the landlord will find it difficult to evict them. It also gives squatters more extortion power over property owners. The main beneficiary of all these measures are sitting tenants, and to a certain extent squatters, whilst the cost falls squarely on landlords, and according to research by CBRE, an international property company, less than 5% of Spain's rental stock belongs to big funds, so most of the cost will fall on small investors who don't have a lot of financial wiggle room. The government justifies these measures as protecting vulnerable groups, but most tenants are not vulnerable. The government could have offered targeted rental payment support to tenants struggling to pay rents rising with inflation, but it would have had to pay for that. So I've explained briefly how the war in Ukraine is affecting Spain and how the government has responded on the housing front with interventions that benefit sitting tenants at the expense of landlords in order to protect vulnerable groups. But in conclusion, it doesn't look like Spain is having a bad war, especially compared to some other countries. As a result, the war justification looks a bit flimsy, even if many households are worse off because of inflation, in part due to the war. I think that targeted rental support for those who need it would have been more justifiable. So I couldn't help wondering if the government has a hidden agenda, or at least is using the war to justify measures it wants to pursue for other reasons. What other reasons might the government have? One possibility that occurs to me is good old politics, with a general election due later this year. As I said before, the 2% rental revision cap is an inflation windfall for tenants at the expense of landlords. 3/4 of Spanish households are owner-occupiers who are not directly affected by these measures, so the government won't be worried about them unless they are also landlords, which I assume most aren't. But just under 20% of the population who live in rented homes might remember this back-scratching come election time. Tenants are a bigger pool of votes than landlords, and politicians don't miss things like that. Another possibility is that this might be the product of government horse trading between the centre-left socialists and the hard-left Podemos party, who are the two coalition parties in the government. The government was supposed to pass a new housing bill last year, but the two coalition partners are still arguing over it. Podemos are pushing for rent controls all over Spain and other interventions that the socialists are resisting, so perhaps these measures are partly a sop to Podemos to keep them on board whilst not giving them what they really want, in other words, a bargaining chip. Whatever the real reason, or real reasons, I suspect these measures are here to stay until a new housing law is passed or a change of government, even if the war ends tomorrow. Good news for sitting tenants, bad news for landlords, and unlikely to encourage private investment in rental housing, which is also bad news for future tenants. As an aside, I'm aware that Podemos and co reject this argument, but I find it convincing. They argue that the key to affordable housing is rental caps and landlord restrictions, which won't have any impact on supply, and to me that makes no sense. None of this directly affects owner-occupiers or second homeowners, but measures like this that reduce the quantity and quality of rental housing over time are bad news for the housing market in the long run, however you justify them in the short term. Well, that's all for today, so thanks for watching.